Hey everybody, this is Russ from Mental Game Core. I got the Odin 3 in the mail yesterday, so let's do an impressions video. I'm going to talk about the look and feel of it, and then give me a week or so to fully test it, and then I will do the in-depth review. Now, longtime viewers of this channel know that one of my favorite devices of all time is the Odin 2. This was my favorite handheld of 2023, and it was the most played handheld that I had in 2024. And so as you can imagine, I'm very excited about the Odin 3, and I'm wondering whether or not it's going to replace it as my favorite mid-size handheld. There are two main differences. The Odin 3 has a new screen. It's essentially the same as on the AYN Thor, 6 inches, 120 Hz, and OLED. And it's also got a lot more horsepower with the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor, which also comes with its own shortcomings. We've got a lot to discuss. I'll try to keep it as trim as possible, so grab your favorite snack and drink. Let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start with the specs, then we'll talk about pricing. So number one, the CPU, like I mentioned, is the Snapdragon 8 Elite. And this chip runs the Adreno 830 GPU, which is really powerful, but does have some compatibility issues, especially with emulators, which we'll talk about later. Now, the RAM and internal storage will depend on the model that you get. You'll get anything from 8 to 24 gigs of RAM, and from 128 gigs to 1 terabyte of internal storage. It's also worth noting that every model comes with a micro SD card slot, so you can always expand the storage that way too. One of the big changes with the Odin 3 is this new AMOLED display, 6 inches, 1080p resolution, and runs at 120 Hz. It's also got the same size battery as the Odin 2, 8000 mAh, which I think is plenty for a mid-size handheld. According to the spec sheet, it should also fast charge up to 60 watts, but I found in my own testing with a 100 watt power supply, it only charged at 26, which I think is still very fast. In terms of weight, my unit is 380 grams, or about 13.5 ounces. And to give you an idea of perspective, it's about 25% heavier than the Nintendo Switch Lite and about 10% lighter than the Switch OLED. As far as connectivity, we've got really good options here, Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 6.0, and it also has USB-C video out via DisplayPort at 4K 60 Hz. It's also running Android 15 and has a couple other bells and whistles like Hall sensor analog sticks and triggers. Now, since the first Odin came out, these devices have always been their flagship models. Essentially, they are their top-tier Android handhelds that are pushing the absolute best in terms of performance and price. And a flagship handheld will come with flagship prices, and so this is one of the more expensive Android devices you can find. The starting price is $330. And while that's still a very fair price for the Snapdragon 8 Elite chipset, it's still an expensive handheld. If you want to increase the storage and the RAM, it's going to go up from there. The Pro model, which comes with 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, is $400. If you want to bump it up to the Max model with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage, that's going to cost you $450. And then finally, they now have a Max tier. This is the first time we've seen that. It's at $520, but it'll come with 24 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of internal storage. At the end of the day, it really comes down to what you plan on doing with the Odin 3. I think that if you're just going to be doing emulation, then 8 gigabytes might be enough with the base model, but 12 gigabytes will probably give you a little bit more headroom. But one of the big benefits of the Snapdragon 8 Elite is its ability to play PC games via apps like Windlater and GameHub, and that requires additional RAM, and a lot of those apps also require you to install the game on the internal storage. So if you are really looking to push the PC gaming aspect of the Odin 3, that's where something like the Pro and the Max tier make a little bit more sense. Now, like with other AYN products, if you get just the base model, it's only going to come in black. If you want any of the other colors, you'll have to get either the Pro and Beyond models. And I think the other colors look great. There's a white model and a rainbow one that has a 16-bit look to it, and then two transparent options, blue and purple. They've also got a bunch of accessories available on their website, including a grip and a case and screen protector. We will talk more about this in a minute. So let's take a look at the device, and of note, this was sent over from AYN for review, but I have purchased my own. It just hasn't arrived yet. Now, like with all my reviews, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. The box is very bare bones, but you can see that on the side they have a listing of all the different models and the different colors. They say they sent me a Pro, but it's actually a Max model, so I'm going to be testing it with 16 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of storage, and mine is clear blue. Inside the box, we've got a quick manual that will just show off some of the specs. We've got a USB-C charging cable, and then of course the device itself. And first impressions with the handheld is that it reminds me of a cross between the AYN Odin 2 as well as the Odin 2 Portal, which came out last year. It just kind of has that same sort of size as the original Odin 2, but the sleek form factor of the Odin 2 Portal. It's got an all-glass front to it, as you can see here. And then mine is the transparent blue, as you can see too, which is a color that they had with the original Odin 2 that I really liked as well. So yeah, it's kind of neat. It's like a throwback to the Odin 2, but then modernized a little bit using the Odin 2 Portal aesthetics. It's a pretty simple and intuitive layout. We've got an analog stick up top, a D-pad down below. Same thing with here. We got our face buttons and then another analog stick, start and select buttons on each side. We've got our menu buttons from Android. So all of this is very familiar and exactly the same layout as the original Odin 2. The big changes for me is that it feels a lot more compact. It's not quite as tall. And then also it feels a little bit chunkier in the back. Some of this has to do with the fact that we've got this new plastic texture here around the grips, much like the Retroid Pocket 5. It's really grippy. It feels really nice on the fingers. So we've got a variety of different plastic textures. We've got a smooth plastic here on the back. We've got this grippy plastic here around the grips. And then we've got this smooth glass that we have all around the edges that is kind of rounded along the sides. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of this all glass front. I feel like it makes the device a lot smudgier and shinier, and that's not necessarily something that I want in a handheld. So I understand that it does make it a lot sleeker looking, but I personally would like an all plastic device. But there's also no denying that it has a very sleek and premium look to it as well. I think it's a sharp looking handheld. In terms of size, it is very similar to the Odin 2. They both have a 6-inch panel to them, the same button layout and everything, but this one is quite a bit larger. If we stack them up one on top of the other, you can see that there's about a half-inch difference between the two here on the top. The overall width and the thickness are about the same, although the triggers, as you can see, are a lot wider on the Odin 3. It kind of reminds me of the bigger brother version of the Retroid Pocket 5, which has a 5.5-inch display instead of 6, but also still very similar in terms of aesthetics. This one also has an all-glass front to it, and so yes, they're kind of similar in that regard, but this one is quite bigger. But it's also significantly smaller than the Odin 2 Portal, which has that 7-inch display, but a similar overall aesthetic layout too. I think the closest analogy is going to be Ioneo's Conquer Pocket Fit. This one also has a 6-inch display and a very similar layout that's mostly glass on the front, although this one is an LCD panel. Another similarity is that the Conquer Pocket Fit is going to have a Snapdragon 8 Elite version of this device as well, which should have almost identical performance between the two. The one that we're looking at right here is a lower spec model. It's the Snapdragon G3 Gen 3, which personally I think is a really good chipset, especially when it comes to compatibility. And so personally, I think this is an excellent handheld already, but it's been having a really hard time getting out the door. Ioneo has been delaying their release of this device, and they haven't been shipping on time. And then finally, one more size comparison. Here's the Nintendo Switch Lite. So this one feels like a beefier version of this. It's got a bigger screen. This one's only 5.5 inches. And of course, this is OLED 120 Hertz. But yeah, you can see that they're kind of within spitting distance. And so overall, in terms of size and weight, it's a pretty standard mid-sized handheld. It is something that is kind of like a smaller companion to a larger Steam Deck. But I also would not consider this to be a pocketable handheld. If you've got big pockets, like maybe you're wearing shorts, maybe you can squeeze it in, but it's not necessarily something that is comfortable to walk around with. Instead, I would consider it to be a handheld that's better suited to throw in a backpack or maybe play on the couch, something like that. Another reason why I don't think it's very pocketable is because they've really upgraded the size of these sticks. So let's talk about the controls, starting with these analog sticks. So these have been fully repurposed. They are a much bigger housing, and then these sticks themselves stick out a lot from the device too. And honestly, I think it feels great. Now, admittedly, it does look a little bit weird that they stick out so much, but when you're actually playing them, I think it's a very comfortable experience in terms of the sticks themselves. So I've been testing this with a bunch of first-person shooter games and other similar analog stick-centric games. It's been a real delight. It kind of feels like the same kind of sticks that you can buy on Etsy that are purposefully very tall to give you much more accuracy, but they're coming like this out of the box, which I think is a really cool move. The caps themselves are the same ones that used to come with the Odin 2 Portal if you pre-ordered, or you could buy them on their website for like $5. So they are like the larger upgraded sticks. They're kind of a soft rubber, but they are still very grippy. And like with all their sticks, you can pull the caps off and then swap them out with something else. So if you wanted something more low profile, I bet you could find a third-party option on Etsy too. Now the D-pad is the same as it's been on any of the other Odin devices. It's a PS Vita style D-pad with dome switches underneath. It's a little bit on the small side, but I think it's a really good D-pad. And this is the same kind of D-pad you often will find on the Retroid Pocket devices as well. It's super precise and just feels really good. So it'll pass something like the Contra test where I can rock it left and right, and it's only really going to move the character when it physically clicks over, so it feels very precise and responsive. It's not my favorite type of D-pad for Street Fighter style games. I still prefer that old rubber membrane feel like a Super Nintendo controller, but after a few seconds of testing it out, I can usually acclimate to this one as well, so I think it's perfectly suitable too. And it really shines when playing a precision game like Celeste, where it's really important to hit the diagonals or the cardinal points when you want to, and this just has that in spades, so it's an excellent D-pad all around. So now let's talk about the face buttons. These are rubber membrane buttons, much like they've been on other Odin devices, and they are reminiscent of the Odin 2 Portal in that they are slightly clacky. Like I feel like they have a bit too much travel to them, and they also feel like they are slightly grinding against the plastic on the sides of the case as well, which is not a very good feeling, and it doesn't sound great either. I think the best way to demonstrate this is to do a quick audio test against other similar handhelds. So we'll start with the Odin 3 and then move on to the others. So putting it all together, I do like the fact that they are not as loud as the Odin 2 Portal, but they're still louder than I would like them to be. I still prefer the original Odin 2 buttons. If I had to assign them a letter grade, I would probably give them a B, because I think they are above average, and they are an improvement over the Odin 2 Portal, but they're not quite at that A-level tier for me. The good news is the buttons themselves feel good as you press it down, and so if you're not super picky like me, you will probably think these buttons are just fine. Also on the front, we've got our select and start buttons, and then our Android home and back buttons, and these are all the same. They are micro switches that have some sort of dampening to them, so they are nice and quiet. And then finally, we've got our two stereo speakers. I think the placement here is okay. As I'm holding it, I do feel that I'm covering a little bit of the speaker, but not that much. And in terms of audio quality, I think it's above average as well. Let me give you a listen. And so for me, this all sounds great. It's nice and crisp and clear, and I can hear the difference between the low, mids, and highs very easily. So yes, I think this is a pretty good sounding handheld. Up top, we've got our volume up and down, an LED indicator that'll turn on when you're charging, and then also a power button that is a fingerprint sensor. The shoulders and triggers, I think, are great. They have a new texture to them that feels really nice. It kind of sticks in your hands, which is perfect. And I think they also feel very good. The triggers, for example, just have a nice gliding motion to them, and they're so big that I feel like I can press them anywhere. So yes, these feel excellent. The shoulder buttons are easy to press down on. You can kind of hit them from anywhere, but they are a little bit clickier than I would like. Let's do another audio sample. And I would say that these shoulder buttons are about the same volume as the original Odin 2, but a little bit louder than the Retroid Pocket 5. On the back, you can see we have our fan intake and exhaust on the right, and then they also made it symmetrical just to make everything look pretty, so we have holes on the left side too. We've also got these two buttons on the back that are programmed in the software to be basically anything you would like. The nice thing about these is that they kind of blend into the rest of the console, and so it's easy to find them, but also very easy to ignore them if you want. And I personally don't really use these types of buttons on Android devices, and so I like the fact that they are there, that I don't really have to pay attention to them either. And then finally, on the bottom, we've got a little flap for the micro SD card reader. And then in addition, we've got our 3.5mm headphone jack, and then our USB-C that is capable capable of video out. So overall, not a lot of surprises when it comes to the controls. This is almost exactly like the original Odin 2, but just a little bit more compact and sleeker. And I was hoping that the face buttons would be a lot like the original console, but they do still have that same sort of clackiness as the Odin 2 Portal, but not quite as bad. I think the big star of the show are these upgraded analog sticks. You could always get bigger caps to make them kind of have this height, but I like the fact that they're coming like this out of the box. Okay, now let's talk about ergonomics and what it's like to actually hold the device and how comfortable it is. A lot of it comes down to the ergonomic bumps on the back, which are reminiscent of the original Odin 2, and I personally always love these big chunky grips. There are some people who would prefer a more flat design, but for me, I think this is just about right. As you cup it, it's pretty easy to find a space where your index fingers rest up top, your middle finger goes right here, and then the other two fingers are kind of down below. But this is also where I started to notice that it's not quite as comfortable for me ergonomically as the original Odin 2, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's so compact that there's not a lot of space for my bottom two fingers. And so as I've been holding this device, I found that my pinkies just kind of fall down on the bottom, and this happens a lot with shorter devices like the Retroid Pocket 5, where there's just not enough space for your whole hand. And so even though we do have a more compact handheld compared to the original Odin 2, that does leave less space for my pinkies down below. The other thing I noticed is the device naturally sits a little bit higher in my hands. You can see it's kind of near the top of my palms as opposed to resting at the bottom here, which does leave me with a little bit less leverage as I'm holding it. And it was definitely something that I noticed when playing twin stick style games like Destiny 2 right here, where I'm missing a little bit of that leverage at the bottom just to make it a more comfortable feeling. And because I was missing that leverage, I found that I was playing this game by not aiming down the sights as much as I usually do, just because when I pressed on the left trigger, it kind of shifted the device in my hands in not a good way. And the fact that I was having to change my play style to accommodate the ergonomics of this device to me was not a great sign. Now, thankfully, the company is selling TPU grips for the Odin 3. Initially, I didn't think they were going to be necessary because the Odin 2 for me didn't require grips because it was nice and chunky, but I think because of this shorter stature of the Odin 3, these grips are something that I am going to pick up and try out. So it may come to pass that the ergonomics do get improved with that grip, but I will say that this is a little bit less comfortable when playing twin stick shooters compared to the original Odin 2. Now, speaking of accessories, AON did send out a couple for me to test. I've got a TPU shell right here, and then also a screen protector. Now, with these screen protectors, I usually don't use them because they're on an all-glass device, and I don't like the idea of adding even more glass to a device that already has a little bit too much for my tastes. But either way, you can see the overall design here where it's got a bunch of empty circles, which will go right in this spot right here. So it's not going to inhibit any of the controls in any way. It's just going to add additional protection. So if you want to get something like this, you can totally do it. I personally don't want to add additional glass to my handheld. Now, this TPU shell is probably something I wouldn't use either because it really is just a protective shell. It's not adding any additional like grip or anything to it. It adds a little bit of bulk, but that's about it. It's really there to protect the device. And personally, I think it's a bit of a downgrade. I think it looks just a little bit more like chunky and kind of 90s in a way that I don't really like. And it also covers up the plastic texture that I really like on the back grip too. And so to me, this is kind of a downgrade overall, but if you're really looking to protect your device, yes, you can do that with this TPU shell as well as that screen protector. And speaking of screens, let's talk about this display because I think it is very nice. It's, 120 Hz AMOLED 1080p resolution, and it looks to be the exact same screen as on the AYN Thor, which I thought was excellent there too. For the most part, I've been playing it at around 55 to 60% brightness, which is what you can see right here, and that's been great in most indoor environments. It also gets very bright. It says it's spec'd to 650 nits of peak brightness, and you can see that yes, it completely blows out my camera up above. In fact, here it is in broad daylight under direct sunlight, and you can see that the image is still clearly visible. And so, yes, this is a handheld that you can easily play outdoors. On the other hand, it also gets very dim to the point where it's hard to see in a lighted environment. Even if turning off my studio lights, you can barely see that anything is going on here. And that's an excellent thing if you plan on playing this device in the dark, like say, for example, in bed next to your significant other. Just bear in mind that the face buttons and the shoulders are a little bit louder than I would like, so you might get some complaints there. Now, assuming this is the same screen as the AYN Thor, it is worth noting that I have seen some complaints about the Thor's display in that some people have experienced image retention, like they're playing a certain game and then they move on to something else and they can still see artifacts of that previous game on the display. It goes away after a bit, but it's something that a lot of people don't like to see. It's not something I've seen with my Thor, and it's not something I've seen on this Odin 3 just yet, but I'm keeping an eye out on it, and if I do see it, I'll try to demonstrate it in a video, but so far it's been smooth sailing for me. But if you are concerned about that, that is something to bear in mind. But in the end, I really do like this display. I like the contrast ratio and the richness of the colors, and it also has a lot of horsepower, which allows you to do other things like using black frame insertion because we have a 120 Hz panel. You can also use heavy-duty shaders like the CRT Royale shader that I'm using right here to really enhance the overall look of your retro gaming, and of course it's going to work great in other regards too. So I think overall it's just a really well-rounded display in many different use cases, especially with the high refresh rate and the OLED colors. Okay, let's talk a bit about software. This is an Android-based device, which means that it's really going to be the same as setting up any other Android-based handheld. I've got guides for it. I'll leave one link down below. The main thing to bear in mind is most of the settings that you can configure will be in the top-down menu. If you drag down right here, you can change out things like your performance mode or turn on the LED lights around the analog sticks and adjust the fan as well. And all these settings are the exact same as they are on the Thor and the other Odin 2 devices, and so no surprises here, it's the exact same experience. We've got 3 different performance modes. You can probably keep it in standard for just about everything until you get into PC gaming. That's when I would pump it up to high performance mode, but for the most part, everything has been working great in standard. And you're going to have different fan settings depending on your performance profile, but in general, I just leave it on smart depending on what I'm playing, and then the fan will ramp up when it needs to. And of course, I can always put it into sport to turn it on full blast. And the fan does get quite loud when you put it on full blast. Let's toggle between smart and sport so you can hear it. So overall, I would say the baseline noise level at sport mode is a little bit louder than the original Odin 2, but not to the point where I would say it's noisy. I've also heard some reports where people say it doesn't sound very pleasant, but I haven't noticed that with my own unit. I think it sounds perfectly fine. Here's another test. Now, on the subject of cooling, one thing I did notice when playing Game Hub is that the temperatures got really high, to the point of like the mid-90s Celsius, and that was kind of alarming. For the most part, everything up to 90 for me is pretty normal, and I do realize the Snapdragon 8 Elite is a hot-running chip that is designed to run pretty hot, especially in smartphones, but still, I don't like seeing anything above 90 degrees, so this did warrant further research. Now, swiping from the right to bring up the Odin settings gives me completely different readouts at about 60 degrees Celsius compared to 95. And unfortunately, I'm not really sure what temperature that they're grading on each of these different measurements. Is it the CPU, the GPU, or the battery? Now, when I quickly swipe over to AIDA64 while the game is still running, I found that the temperatures are a lot closer to the Odin settings, where it's about in the mid-50s or lower, even when pushing it to the max. There are dozens of different temperature readouts here, but I did notice that one of them is unusually high, but to a crazy degree, like 130, 140 degrees Celsius, but it would fluctuate between that and something much lower. So I'm not sure if this is just a weird readout from one of the sensors or if this is actually getting that hot. But I would say based on what I'm seeing in AIDA64, whose sensors I would trust more than the other 2 apps, I think this is going to be okay. For what it's worth, I can say that in actually playing this device, it's been very pleasant. I mean, I can feel the air moving through the fan when I put it in sport mode, and it's actually kind of cool. It's cooler than the rest of the device, but there's no warmth coming into my fingers at all. And so ambient heat overall has been absolutely fine. I'll see if I can do more tests for the final review, but as it stands right now, I'm not particularly concerned. Okay, now let's talk about benchmarks. We're going to start with Wildlife Extreme from 3D Mark, which is a 4K render test. I'm going to do a lot more in-depth testing in my final review, but I can at least give you some preliminary results. And the score I got in the Odin 3 is 6121, nearly double the Odin 2, which is a powerhouse on its own, and about 1500 points better than the G3 Gen 3 found in the Conquer Pocket Fit. And so the Odin 2 clearly has a lot of raw power to it, making it the most powerful Android handheld that I've ever seen. Now moving over to Geekbench, this is a CPU intensive test right here, and you can see that this is also quite a bit higher. 2939 on the Odin 3 compared to 2241 or 2070 on the other two devices. And that's just based on the single core score, which is very important when it comes to emulation. It also has a higher multi-core score, so if there are any emulators that require that too, this one is going to have higher points, 7714 versus 7148 and 5718. And looking at the GPU benchmark in Geekbench using the Vulkan backend, there's a big difference here as well. 25,500 or so with the Odin 3 versus 19,000 on the Conquer, and then finally only 10,000 on the Odin 2. So this is 250% better, at least in this particular test. So you might be wondering, what does that mean in a real world context? We'll use God of War 2 as our example. So this I'm running at a 2.5x resolution, which is going to max out the pixels that are available on this display. So there's no real reason to max it beyond 2.5x because that's the best it's going to look. But the thing is, we've got so much horsepower on this device that I can actually upscale it to a 5x resolution, which is going to be beyond 4K, and it's still going to run at full speed. And so that's kind of the really cool thing about this, is that you can play these games at a 4K resolution. Now, it's not going to matter that much when playing it in handheld mode, but this thing also outputs to a 4K resolution when plugging it into a television, which means that yes, you could play these games in 4K on a 4K TV. And that's the beauty of this processor. We've got enough power here to, yes, play these at a 5x resolution upscale. Here's another example with Jak 3, a very difficult game to emulate on the PS2, and it's running just fine at a 5x resolution. So yes, we've got a lot of overhead here to be able to play these games not only at a 1080p resolution, but all the way up to 4K, even with demanding titles. And I should also clarify that all those tests on PS2 were done with the OpenGL backend, which is the less performant backend, which means it's going to be more demanding, but it's more accurate. So we're getting a 4K resolution with the OpenGL backend. We're not even going into Vulkan. So yes, I think that's a really great sign. And I got similar results with GameCube emulation too, again, running it at 5x or 4K resolution upscale, and it's playing absolutely fine with one of the most demanding games, F-Zero GX. In fact, if we look at the right here, you can see this max speed is around 200% when playing this game, which means that we have twice as much horsepower as we need, even when playing it in a 4K resolution. And so yes, I think that when it comes to playing GameCube and PS2, we're finally hitting that 4K era with these particular systems, which is kind of amazing. However, there are going to be some limitations with the Odin 3, and a lot of it has to do with the chipset as well as the software. So from a software perspective, this should have enough power to be able to play PS3 titles. And we've got two different emulators. We've got APS3E, we've also got RPCX, and these are both in active development, although we haven't seen an update in RPCSX in over 6 months at this point. They're still being worked on. And so, yes, the software is coming along, but it's not to the point of being actually playable. I will do a lot more testing in my final review with that particular system, but that's kind of where we are, where, yes, we've got enough power to be able to play these systems, but the software isn't quite there yet. Another problem with the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor is that it doesn't have the ability to load custom turnip drivers. They just haven't been developed yet. And so as a result, we have to rely on the native Adreno drivers for this device, which does cause some limitations, especially when it comes to Switch emulation. We've got plenty of horsepower to be able to play just about anything you could throw at it at the Switch level, but unfortunately the accuracy is not quite there for certain games. Many of the bigger titles like Mario Odyssey actually play surprisingly well, so there's no issues here graphically or performance-wise. But other games that run just fine on the other Snapdragon chipsets, like on the Conquer Pocket Fit and the Odin 2, do not play well with the Snapdragon 8 Elite. A good example is Metroid Prime Remastered, which I tried several different times in multiple emulators and it crashed every single time. And strangely, another game that I had tested just fine on a Snapdragon 8 Elite phone was somehow not working on the Odin 3. This is Octopath Traveler 2, and it didn't get past the initial loading screen. Now, when switching over to Citron, I was able to load up the game, so it is possible that you can play this one, but I did find that it had a lot of weird lighting and texture issues when playing it on Citron. And so I think that Switch emulation on the Snapdragon 8 Elite processor is improved over the past few months compared to previous versions, but the the fact that we don't have these robust third-party turnip drivers does limit the overall gameplay experience. And this is something I talked about in a video when the Odin 3 was first announced a couple months back, where I was a little bit concerned that this would actually be a downgrade when it comes to Switch emulation. And I think in many ways it kind of does feel like that compared to the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 or the G3 Gen 3. What I imagine is a lot of users are going to have to be switching back and forth between Eden and Citron and Kenji NX, which are the main 3 Nintendo Switch emulators on Android. And the fact that you'll have to juggle 3 different apps and the experience will still not be as good as it is on the other devices is kind of telling. I saw the same thing when I tested Breath of the Wild on Nintendo Wii U. The game played pretty well. It was about 30 frames per second. It would sometimes dip down below that, but it was a pretty enjoyable experience, except for all the graphical glitches that I experienced as I was playing it. And even though this app does allow you to load up custom third-party drivers, it doesn't really matter because they're not available for this particular chipset. Now, obviously, I've got a lot more testing to do, and I want to really get a better gauge of how good or bad this is going to be with the Snapdragon 8 Elite, but unfortunately, this is exactly what I was concerned about with this particular handheld. The way I see it, the Odin 3 should be an upgrade in every single way, but when it comes to some emulation circumstances, it does feel a bit like a downgrade. Now, one place that does feel like a big ol' upgrade is when playing PC games via different platforms like Game Native and Game Hub and Game Hub Lite. I tested out all 3 apps this afternoon, and I found it was an excellent experience on all of them. Game Hub Lite is a lot like the full-fat version, but it requires a lot less permissions, so you don't have to log in, you don't have to accept any additional permissions either. So if you are more data conscious, this would be the better option. I tried a couple lightweight games on this. Hades 2 played fine, about 60 frames per second, and then I was able to play Silksong at 120 frames per second, no problem. I also tried out the regular Game Hub version, which I think has the best performance among the 3, and I did really want to push it too. So I put on Resident Evil 2, which does have a lot of back-end configurations for it with this particular game within Game Hub. And I found that when playing within like an indoor or corridor environment, it played pretty great, about 35 frames per second, which was very playable. This is at 720p with about medium settings. However, when I got into a larger open area with lots of things going on, like multiple zombies and like cars burning and stuff, the frame rate would dip down to about 20 frames per second. It's still mostly playable, but I would not consider this to be a very enjoyable experience. However, this is still a much better experience than trying to play this game on any other Android-based handheld out right now. And so yes, that's one of the cool things about the Snapdragon 8 Elite, is that we have all the horsepower to be able to play some of these pretty demanding games. And then finally, I also tested out Halo Reach via the Halo Master Chief Collection here on the Odin 3 on Game Native. Now, this is kind of a fun story. So I was testing it out on the Thor via Game Hub a couple weeks back, and I tweeted about it, and I was like, hey, it's pretty cool that I can play this game on a clamshell. It wasn't running well, about 15-20 frames per second, but it was still pretty cool. And to my surprise, the developer of Game Native replied and said, yeah, we're not getting this working on Game Native just yet. Let me try it out. And lo and behold, a couple weeks later, he tweeted back and said, you know what? I got it fixed. It's working now on Game Native. And sure enough, when I tried it out today, yes, I was able to log in with my Microsoft account and I was able to play Halo Reach. And it plays really well. It's about 60 frames per second as you're walking around, and it'll dip down to about 50 or 55 frames per second when you're shooting bad guys. And I think that is absolutely playable. And I think this speaks volumes about the PC gaming potential of the Odin 3. In fact, this is probably the main thing that separates it from the Odin 2. It's nice to have a new screen, but the fact that I can play a game like Halo Reach on it is really kind of incredible. Now, beyond just playing games locally, you could always do streaming as well. So here I am playing NVIDIA GeForce Now. I have one of those higher tiers, which allows me to play at 120 frames per second. So here I am with Doom Eternal, 1080p Ultra settings, and it's playing great. I also tested it out with local game streaming via Apollo and Artemis. So this is running just on a PC here in the studio, and I'm getting a steady 120 frames per second, and my decoding time is about 0.85 milliseconds, and that is excellent as well. This is so responsive that it feels like I'm playing locally on the device. So if you're looking for a 6-inch screen handheld that you can use for local game streaming, I think the Odin 3 is going to be excellent. Okay, I think that was a lot of testing for an impressions video, so let's start wrapping up and talk about the good and the bad impressions that I've gotten so far in these first 24 hours. We'll start with the good stuff. Number one, this is a very high quality device. It just feels like it's a premium little handheld, and it definitely feels like it's worth that price that you pay for it. I also love that it's a mid-tier size. This is my overall favorite size and form factor. About 6-inch screen is about perfect for me for a mobile handheld device. So for me personally, it's hitting a lot of wickets, especially with that beautiful screen. I love the fact that it's upgraded to OLED and it runs at 120 Hz. It opens up a world of possibilities, and I think it looks beautiful as well. I'm also very impressed by the raw power that we have here. It's obviously an upgrade from the original Odin 2, which I think was satisfactory for most people anyway. And it really does shine if you want to focus on playing PC games via the apps that we were talking about earlier, because it is just another level of performance compared to those other devices. Now, I've got a few bad impressions too, and the first is that it feels like this device is a little bit compact. One of the things I liked about the Odin 2 is that it had a little bit more heft to it. It was a bit larger, a bit heavier, and it was a perfect size and feel for me. I think they tried to trim down the Odin 3 a lot to make it more sleek, and I think they trimmed it down a little bit too much because it's less comfortable than its predecessor. So I do feel like this is a device that I'm going to have to test with a grip in the future, because that will probably fix my issues, but I would have loved to have not used a grip at all. Another big one for me is the driver compatibility. It is kind of a bummer that this thing feels like a downgrade when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation, when this feels like it would be an excellent Nintendo Switch machine. You could play all these games in docked mode with this raw power, but unfortunately, many of these games are just not going to work. It almost feels like this is a handheld that is making promises right now for a future that may or may not come. Sure, Nintendo Switch emulation might get better in the future, but right now it does feel like a downgrade. And sure, yes, this has enough power to be able to play things like PS3, but the software isn't quite there yet either. It almost feels like the Odin 3 is a device that it's ahead of its time, and that yes, it's got a lot of raw power, but it's still waiting on drivers as well as software updates to actually get the most out of it. So at the end of the day, based on my impressions right here, yes, I think that the Odin 3 is an excellent handheld. I can't wait to test it over the next week and make a full-on review. But at the same time, I don't feel a lot of urgency to pick up this device in the first place, just because I think that if I waited 6 months, it would be even better. And so I would say, in terms of FOMO and everything else, if you've got a device that works pretty well for your needs, then there's probably not a lot of reason to upgrade to the Odin 3, because it might not be an upgrade in some of the ways that are important to you. Anyway, that's it for my impressions video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you excited about the Odin 3, or do you think it's just a bit ahead of its time? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.